We're going to get started on our second to last session of the day, I suppose. Before we do that, I talked to Jeff and he just wanted me to let people know for the dinner tonight, because the location is not on your program. For the dinner tonight, meet down here after the last sessions are over, so 6:45 or so. And then he or someone else will walk us over to where the dinner is going to be.
But these are those who registered for dinner, or are there extra dinners? Because I think Jeff ordered some extras, but there was a deadline and there was a registration. So
if you have ordered dinner, meet us out here afterwards. If you have not ordered dinner, pre-ordered dinner, but you'd like to come anyway, come and talk to maybe Olga or myself or Jeff. Okay, come and talk to Jeff sometime between now and then and see if there's extra room or not. Because there should be room for a few other people, but we're not sure. Okay. This session before us is an hour and a half. So our first speaker is Charlie Gillespie. He is assistant professor of Catholic studies at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. Nailed it. And so he is a plenary session, so he will have an hour, roughly 30 to 40 minutes for his paper, and then 20 to 30 minutes for conversations afterwards. And then I'll announce the second speaker when we have a second speaker. So I'll do that one next. This is a hard time slot. It is late in the day and everyone is tired. I am tired and I am exhausted. And Charlie is going to keep us awake because that is what Charlie does. Charlie is great. So you're in for a treat. So join me in welcoming Charlie Gillespie.
Absolutely no pressure to be the caffeine. My title is Phenomenological Closeness, Performative Relationality in Quantum Systems and Religious Experience. I'm going to start by offering my thanks to the organizers, Olga, Jeff, and the team, as well as for really, really rich conversations thus far. My presentation is going to literally, figuratively, and spiritually lean into the exploratory workshop side of things. And so because we're going to arrive at a close reading of Julian of Norwich's vision of a hazelnut as a phenomenology of closeness that articulates the performative relationality shared by quantum systems and religious experience, I thought I'd start there, so that in case we run out of time, we've nonetheless gotten closer to something. So from the 5th chapter of the long text of Julian's showings, and in this, he showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. As it seemed to me, and it was as round as a ball, I looked at it with the eye of my understanding and thought, what can this be? I was amazed that it could last, for I thought that nothing of its littleness, it would suddenly have fallen into nothing. And I was answered in my understanding. It lasts and always will because God loves it, and thus everything has being through the love of God. In this little thing, I saw 3 properties. The first was that God made it. The second, that God loves it. And the third, that God preserves it. But what did I see in it? It is that God is the creator and the protector and the lover. For until I am substantially united to him, I can never have perfect rest or true happiness. Until, that is, I am so attached to him that there can be no created thing between my God and me. This little thing, which is created, seemed to me as if it could have fallen into nothing because of its littleness. Religious experience can prompt a totalizing sense of unity, a kind of spooky closeness in all that is. Religious experience in itself is a slippery and spooky term, right? Primarily, my paper today is interested in the sorts of religious experiences that bring us into experiential union with that which is other than myself. As Julian said, I can never have perfect rest or true happiness until I am so attached to him that there can be no created thing between my God and me, between suspicion. In other words, I aim to develop a phenomenological description of the religious experience of closeness, particularly those experiences that report either feeling close to God or feeling at one with the universe. I'll argue, perhaps provocatively, that the experience may be the same, even if the content of that religious experience is consequentially, ontologically, and theologically quite distinct. How could we experience closeness to everything? Indeed, how could we ever get close to that non-thing that is God? Shouldn't God already be closer to me than I am to myself? The insight is as old as Augustine's confession. Tu autem eras interior intimio meo. You are closer to me than I am to myself. Closeness implies both intimacy and the capacity to parse the indiscernibility of interiority, the interiority of another, even our own, or the interiority of an atom on a quest for the most fundamental subatomic particles. Quantum theory can be spooky because it calls into question the solidity of the world and the reliability of our ordinary phenomenological experience to describe the reality in which we live. Religious experience spooks thinkers because it forces decisions about how to parse experience and what counts as religion. What aspects of experience carry enough numinousness, transcendence, importance, ultimate concern to merit that adjective, religious? Surely, religious experience describes something about the experience in itself and not merely its purportedly religious content. A pilgrimage to last night's Steelers game that made my hotel quite loud might be lauded as a religious experience. So too, the theophany of the bar that Jeff promised before he told us the history of the Phenomenology Center. Perhaps a religious experience is that which enjoys indiscernible wonder, or at the very least, something that cannot be adequately communicated to those not close enough to the phenomenon experienced. I remain perplexed, though, at the level of ordinary conversations by the semantic range of a term like religious experience. It implies some heightened response to profound stimuli, as in Jean-Luc Marien's sense of revelation in the saturated phenomenon, or even William Alston's doxastic practices. The concert becomes revelatory for Emile Durkheim, precisely in the collective effervescence of the crowd, not due to the divinity made manifest in the presence of Taylor Swift. Can you tell I'm in an interreligious relationship at home? Individuality dissolves into the bubbly oneness of the social spin foam. That itself is a technical term for how to imagine the probabilities that depict dynamic space-time under quantum theory. So too, religious experience appears ecstatic. It draws us out of ourselves to become close to others. Even mundane social activities take on the character of a religious experience. Here in our own spooky season, close as we are to both the other world and Halloween's trick-or-treating, it becomes necessary to distinguish between the commercial endeavor of costume pageantry, Christian feast days, and neo-pagan recoveries of pre-colonial Samhain or Dia de los Muertos traditions. All are, in some senses, religious experiences, and all are quite spooky. Spookiness need not imply proximal closeness. Indeed, Albert Einstein famously tried to dismiss quantum entanglement as, quote, spooky action at a distance, end quote. How can it be that two particles light years apart seem to know things about each other? Observe one particle and you will learn the reality of the other, even though that information was not available until the moment and act of observation. The shared information travels instantaneously, appearing to violate the cosmological constant's galactic speed limit for light. Entangled particles remain close despite non-locality. They resonate, vibe, and align, or at least entangled particles perform observable dances that match choreographically in observation. These particles should not be so close to each other over such incomprehensibly vast distances of space and confusions of the passage of time, and yet they are. Entanglement seems to invite spiritual, perhaps even religious language. Perhaps entangled particles are kindred spirits, so close that their shared action at a distance is most clearly defined as spooky. Experiences of entangled closeness exhibit an analogous spookiness to the religious experience of closeness to God, or participation in a radical unity of all that is, was, and shall be. Everything is related. No thing exists in isolation apart from relationality. On some level, our conference has already named the profound achievement of phenomenology over other modes of analysis for grappling with the relatedness of everything. Phenomenology recognizes the problem of objectification, the treatment of phenomena as independent from their relation to other phenomena. On other levels, I want to make a perhaps provocative claim. Quantum mechanics calls into question the status of objects themselves. Perhaps everything is an object, is a non-object, once you get close enough. Can this radically fundamental relationality be experienced discreetly enough to be phenomenologically described? I'm particularly interested in the complexity for phenomenological description brought about by closeness. Theoretical physics uncovers the same problem of perspective familiar to phenomenologists. With what level of distance do we require to have in order to attend to the experience of phenomena in order to describe them? A phenomenological reduction both zooms in and zooms out. It's almost like the famous Hitchcock camera motion that gets close to something even while the background recedes. This double movement in epoche is critical. In order to attend more closely to phenomena, we bracket our ordinary experience and proceed to a level of abstraction. Notice the hand gesture we all tend to naturally do. In order to get closer, one hand moves forward, the other moves back. But as we get closer to phenomena, how we experience that phenomenon changes dramatically. Phenomena become indiscernible from other attitudinal perspectives because the phenomenon undergoes categories of discernment. A black hole, for instance, warps space and time in such a way that any description of what phenomena lie behind the event horizon requires imagining gravitational temporalities that fall into a singular quasi-nothingness, or at the very least, collapse into that singularity of infinite mass and fallen away from the thermal movement of time. More recent developments in quantum loop gravity suggest a lower limit to minimization. Phenomena cannot become smaller than the Planck scale. That exhausts my capacity to make an intervention in the theoretical physics, but nonetheless, I thought you should know, truth in advertising, you can get both a big bang and a big bounce. The experience of being close to God, or at one with the universe, recalls similar language about all-in-all singularity and eternal non-temporality that start to bubble to the surface when we think about quantum mechanics, vast entities in the cosmos, or really, really tiny particular subatomic particles. But I think a phenomenology of closeness can open an analogy between theoretical physics and religious experience in more illuminative directions. Everything is related. Albert Einstein's theories of relativity underscore the centrality of relation. All observation is relative to the observer. Space-time curves when it gets close to a massive object like a black hole. Time and space fluctuate close to the speed of light. Einstein's theories of relativity reflect for natural philosophy, that is physics, the relative subjective ideas that Mike gave us during his plenary yesterday. More pertinent to my paper, however, is how Einstein got close to his space-time bending insights. Years prior to any empirical verification, Einstein developed imag-istic thought experiments for his ideas, chasing a beam of light. How does gravity work in a free-falling elevator moving close to the speed of light? Get a train to go really close to the speed of light and then imagine looking at it and seeing how time or light or space might act differently. Imagination remains capable of getting closer to the complexities of the universe than empirically validated experiments. Our ordinary sense of space-time becomes indiscernible when we get close to the speed of light, precisely because space-time changes based on the position of the observer relative to the phenomena observed. Einstein's thought experiments do not abandon classical physics, but try to think through them to new possibilities in situations where classical rules no longer apply. This paper remains close to language, employing rhetorical strategies of close reading. My method that I threw you into without much preamble aims to entangle the poetics of religious experience with the poetics of quantum theories. Phenomenology can bring them close together. Here I'm thinking of the poetic along the lines theorized by my colleague, Callie Tabor. For Tabor, the poetic constructs and discloses religious phenomena in poetry's unique capacity to pay attention to smallness. Ultimately, the indiscernibility brought by closeness will require wondering about the very, very tiny in its relations. But quantum theory suggests that all matter is ultimately constructed of relations between that which is very, very tiny. Quantum theory in itself is a framework let's try that again. Quantum theory in itself is a framework to posit the relationality of the indiscernibly small. We can't see the atomic. We can still only imagine the subatomic. Even the image of the atom, to which all of us have become familiar, is a little misleading. Those little flying electrons that get an arc of speed, they're not circling the nucleus like a satellite. Rather, the location of an electron remains properly indiscernible until measured. We can know how fast an electron is moving in any given direction, or where an electron is located, but we can't pin down position and velocity at the same time. Therefore, electrons exist in a cloud of indeterminate probabilities that become fixed only once observed. All possible states are true until they're shown not to be. Electrons are events. In fact, all subatomic particles are events. Understanding fundamental relationality with phenomenological closeness shifts registers to the poetic. I mean to argue, however, that the poetics of quantum relationality and the poetics of religious experience do phenomenological work to describe the indiscernible. Quanta, like photons or God, are non-objects. They can be objects of intentionality and thereby thought, and they can be the object of poetics, making a description of that intentionality. But a non-object cannot be objectified. It can't be grasped, held, or made handy in Heidegger's sense. A non-object is a no thing, but this is a no thing that performs, that it can be possible to feel close by. At the end of the paper, I'm going to contend that nothingness of non-objects does not necessarily imply nothingness or emptiness. Rather, I think it points towards a relational ontology where phenomena exist only in and through their relations. All objects, then, are composites of relations. All objects, even the most thingy things, become indiscernible once we get too close to them. To describe this indiscernibility requires thought to transcend ordinary observation. Getting close to indiscernibility pushes us beyond conventional knowledge towards a kind of knowledge only articulatable via poetics. This approach makes central the role of the observer, whether the one who observes the movement of particles at the quantum level, or the one who observes and experiences God or unity with the universe. The experience of indiscernibility cannot be demonstrated through processes that objectify. Here is precisely the glorious and impossible contradiction that makes descriptions of fundamental relationality in quantum action or religious experience spooky. The poetic then provides a technical language for making thought experiments. Theoretical physics, conveniently, begins in thought experiments that only later go questing for empirical verification by experiment. Albert Einstein's theories of relativity underscore the centrality of relation. All observation is relative to the observer. Spacetime curves when close to a massive object. Time and space fluctuate close to the speed of light. Einstein developed such imag-istic thought experiments to explain his ideas. I'm not going to dwell here because in this paper, I'm trying to think about a distinction, that's often made between popular science and academic science, popular religion and technical academic analyses of religious experience. The poetic and the technical are not in opposition. Rather, I aim to do technical phenomenological work utilizing the poetics of quantum mechanics and the poetics of religious experience. But I want to be sensitive, however, to the prevalence of what some scientists and writers like Chris Ferry have memorably termed quantum bullshit. And I'm very excited that that moment is recorded and on the live stream. I tend to agree with Carlo Rovelli when he writes, quote, "The reality of quanta is much stranger than all the delicate, mysterious, enchanting, intricate aspects of our psychological reality and spiritual life." Yet I want to open up the inversion of that claim on the same page. He writes, "The delicate complexity of the emotional connection between ourselves and the universe has as much to do with psi waves as a Bach cantata has to do with a carburetor in Rovelli's old car, end quote. The phenomenology of Bach's counterpoint may invite a new kind of reflection on the complex polyphony of electricity, petroleum, and air that makes gas engines possible. And yes, I did have to look up what a carburetor does. And yes, I was very pleased to learn that it brings different things into relation. Quantum theory, especially Carlo Rovelli's theories of relational quantum mechanics, interprets the world at these indiscernibly small scales that conceive phenomena granularly. Every object becomes a quantum system once we get close enough. We've already encountered this quantum reduction a few times today, so I'm going to skip the section that kind of opens it up, but this is why I put the chair here. This chair appears to us as a chair. We can do an eidetic reduction and get a sense of what its chairiness is. This chair, though, if we got really close, is a network of various quanta that are related, that perform as chair when I relate to it. I'm interested in how this chair as object that we get to observe manifests itself in appearance to me, because quantum particles are indeterminate. They can't be observed like classical phenomena. Quanta that behave like both waves and particles, like a photon or a graviton, can be poetically described, mathematically represented. But these quanta can't be experienced like other objects. What would it mean to experience gravity as an object? Objects experienced in the world, rather, are relations of granular quanta interacting with indeterminate freedom. I want to suggest that we've gotten some tools from phenomenology so far in the conference to talk about these realities in relation to religious experience, but I want to open up the way the philosophy of performativity might make these radically relational quantum systems even more fruitful for how we think about religious experience. But I need to quickly make a key distinction, and I'm going to give myself hives by calling something performativity 1 and performativity 2. Performativity 1 is a technical deployment of a term that names phenomena that cannot be rightly named using another word. Performativity describes that which exists only in its doing. This enters into philosophical discourse following from J.L. Austin's notion of a performative speech act, something like saying to my room of students, class dismissed, and they gather their books and they leave. By speaking class dismissed, I have performed the dismissal of class. It is a thing that exists only in its doing. The problem is we happen to be caught in a historical moment that for the past couple of years have been using what I'm calling performativity 2, a word that could be substituted with theatrical, fake, flashy, showy, engaging, entertaining, fakery, charlatanism, far too much entertainment and good, interesting spectacle. All of those words are great. We're currently using performative in this sense that starts to undermine how performativity might be useful for philosophy and theology. What I mean by that is if you've ever felt yourself wanting to say, the dean just told all the parents that the liberal arts are very important. That was just performative. You might think to yourself, I don't want to make another social media post and just do performative allyship. I want to get in the streets and do something real. Could have said theatrical, could have said fake, but instead we use this word performative that undoes the capacity to talk about those things which are only in their doing. What I want to do is run with that to talk about relationality. Chairs, bread, bears, and black holes only exist for an observer insofar as they're part of a larger quantum system that performs in relation to that observer, who themselves are only a performative quantum system. Run with that one more time. The chair is made up of all sorts of quanta hanging out and performing together. The only way the chair appears to me, according to relational quantum mechanics, is that I become part of a quantum system with the chair. Phenomenologically, we talk about this as appearing to consciousness. We don't say that just because the chair has appeared to me, it has thus ceased appearing to anyone else, or I have magically conjured the chair into existence. What I'm interested in with performative relationality, though, is the way in which the chair can perform in all sorts of ways that aren't necessarily linguistic and aren't necessarily because I'm intending it consciously through language. I can use the chair to sit and now have another performative entity, my lap, appear. Something that only is in its doing. when I think about performative relationality this way, I think it opens up for us a way to think about how quantum theory proposes that all objects are performances of relation. When we start to think about fundamental particles, we begin to imagine the world as a web of relations relating. Quantum systems relate at indiscernibly small scales, but they nevertheless relate at all times. Though performativity remains indiscernible apart from the activity of performance, just as the uncertainty principle makes electrons indiscernible apart from their relations, a performance, nevertheless, can be experienced and described. So to say this slightly differently, performances of non-objects can be experienced just as other non-objects can be experienced. I want to pause for a moment, unless I've gotten too close to performativity and maybe lost the thread of its explanatory help for confronting closeness. I want to argue that the experience of being close to God, or the experience of being at one with the universe, describes not proximity to an object, but rather an experience of the performance of a non-object. That is, performativity discloses relationality without any underlying, stable, independent objects. Performativity describes the conditions for the sort of happening that Felix talked about a little earlier. And happening happens to also be a theatrical term for the kind of avant-garde performance art pieces that just happen in the world. I wonder how much more disclosive the language of performativity would be if instead we just talked about happenings. Rather, closeness to God, or oneness with the universe, means an experience of a performance of relation. That which is experienced in closeness, then, is a performance of relationality. In this paper, I'm pursuing a phenomenological description of a performance of relationality through its articulation as closeness. I think the payout of this approach can be a philosophical description of religious experience that applies across what Mike yesterday talked about as finite regions of meaning. But religious language stays conspicuously close to the physics, too. Carlo Rovelli invokes the Indian mysticism of Nagarjuna to articulate emptiness under these performances of relation. If relational quantum mechanics reveal to us a world of granular relationality at the most fundamental levels of reality, then these relations are that which makes reality real. This is not some being hiding behind relationality. Relations precede relata as that which makes up the physical world. On Rovelli's reading of Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Buddhist intuited how to articulate a world that is relations all the way down. This is Rovelli on Nagarjuna. Quote, "If nothing exists in itself, everything exists only through dependence on something else in relation to something else. The technical term by Nagarjuna to describe the absence of independent existence is emptiness. Things are empty in the sense of having no autonomous existence. They exist thanks to, as a function of, with respect to, in the perspective of something else." End quote. I'm struck by two elements of Rovelli's turn to Nagarjuna. The first is Rovelli's claim that Nagarjuna's utility lies not in his correctness about science. A 2nd century Buddhist knows nothing, quanta, but instead his idea that philosophical ideas are helpful for physicists, not because of the accuracy of the philosophical claim, but because of the possibility to imagine a world that's opened by the account they give. Without abandoning other obligations of philosophy to speak rightly about reality according to right questions or pursue wisdom for worthwhile human living, Rovelli seems to give us a sense of philosophy as intellectual friendship with complexity. It's easier to play with new ideas we have already befriended, an account of Philia Sophia. Nagarjuna is like a shortcut for Rovelli to imagine a granular and relational world. Nothing exists apart from relation, just as the whole of the universe is ultimately a set of mirrored relations of variously quantized realities oscillating in relation to each other. But the world has an event character if we get close enough to it. The world performs this relationality in relation to me. Phenomenological closeness invites me to become part of a performance of relation that exists only in its doing. Fundamentally, events confront events, including perhaps especially my act of intentional consciousness. This leads me to my second reaction to the way Rovelli invokes Nagarjuna and my bridge to looking at Julian to close. The world of radical relationality is empty of essences that exist without relation. So Nagarjuna gives a tool to imagine a world like quantum, where everything is but relationship with nothing fundamental behind it, that allows Rovelli to say, all objects exist in relation. No essence is autonomous in the sense of being self-subsisting and set apart. Much in the same way that language can trick us into describing non-objects as objects, so too, I think, does talk of independent essence that distinguishes objects slide into sounding like an ontology of autonomous independence. I think Rovelli's fascination with emptiness, something where he can describe reality, including ourselves, as nothing but a thin and fragile veil beyond which there is nothing, end quote. Phenomena merely appear to appear, and the thin and fragile veil of perception can be drawn back by something like a quantum reduction if we get close enough, and the world is revealed to ultimately be empty. I want to end my talk by returning to Julian, to show that other religious experiences might report a fullness performing like a non-object. My point's not necessarily to further physics, to resolve the problem of the indiscernible gap between general relativity and quantum mechanics via performative relationality or quantum loop gravity as a theory of everything, but to further our reflection on religious experience. A claim about radical relationality does not negate the possibility for an experience of non-objects, on analogy to the way awareness of the performance of quantum systems does not negate our experience of objects in the world. The poetics of religious experience report how to get close to such non-objects like God, because God's not going to be experienced as an object. My experience of being close to everything in the universe is not going to be experienced like any of the things in that universe I now feel close to. We return here to Julian's hazelnut, her quantized account of creation as a performative quantum system. In Christian theological language, Julian's vision displays a theory of creation's constant reliance on God's love in order for its being. But I also think it's possible to read Julian's vision as a phenomenology of closeness to everything, a phenomenology of religious experience of the world's worldliness as interconnected, unified, hazelnutty. God showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut lying in the palm of my hand, as it seemed to me, and it was as round as a ball. Julian is able to hold this quanta, this grain, this hazelnut ball in the palm of her hand. It appears to her as close enough to be held. I looked at it with the eye of my understanding and thought, what can this be? She performs some sort of reduction. The gaze that falls upon the hazelnut is the eye of understanding as interpretive apperceptive looking. Here, I think, is a moment of visionary theopoetics that operates akin to phenomenological reduction in epoche that zooms in and zooms out. The gaze upon the hazelnut becomes a means of analyzing being as a quantum system. I was amazed that it could last, for I thought that because of its littleness, it would suddenly have fallen into nothing. Here, closeness to that which is very, very tiny raises something like indeterminacy. Getting too close to a little thing will risk its falling away into nothingness. Not the nothingness of non-being, but perhaps the nothingness of non-understanding, the impossibility of a sense when the gaze gets too close, that anxiety that comes from our own worries about being too small and insignificant. Julian says it will last and always will because God loves it, and thus everything is being through the love of God. Performative relationality here becomes the structure on which to hang the theological interpretation of fundamental relationality, as for Julian, the love of God. Julian's quantized creation has being only through a prior love that stops it from falling away into nothingness because of its littleness. Where Rovelli reaches for Nagarjuna to articulate emptiness, I think Julian proposes another possible answer in her revelation of divine love. That is, the quantum creation hazelnut shows the performative relationality at play in quantum systems and religious experience. Closeness leads to the capacity for revelation that invites performative relationality from falling into mystical dissolution, nothingness for the littleness of things. Instead, I think Julian gives us something that returns and recirculates. All performative relationality becomes something like a religious experience, precious in its littleness and indeterminacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was great. We have 22 minutes left. Do you want to field your own question?
I will happily field my, sure, that'd be great. Or you can take a nap, you can do whatever you need to do.
Right. Call me up if you need. So.
Charlie, what do you think? How do we avoid reductionism of God in these parallels? This is the ethical question which bothered me all along, but there was no time to bring it up. So, I mean, quantum physics is materialistic discipline which draws on something that happens in the mind in religious experience partially. But apart from that, how do you think it? Because many are making this mistake, right? Of equating God with quantum mechanics and
Well, Olga, the first answer I have for you is that's a very forgivable mistake because it was super fun to market the Higgs boson as a God particle. Right.
Okay.
So the immediate reaction is we're looking for the most fundamental particles of the universe so that we can make some claim of go, look, the scientists were looking for the a priori thing that gives the world being, and all the religious people were looking for the a priori thing that created the world's being. Phenomenologists were looking for that thing which worlds the world, and everybody over here in a different system is looking for, and we might find a particle that gives us an integrated theory of everything. I'm skeptical of that approach in the same way I'm skeptical of philosophy of religion, always already positing that that means it's studying the symbol of God. Because I think that there are plenty of religious systems that are non-theistic. And so I'm myself in this project and in some others, I think it's more interesting to attend to the practices, material expressions, ways in which folks respond to God as a route to try to get an idea about the divine, and then let that fund how we think about divinity, rather than try to start to find God already at work in another paradigm, because then we're going to fall into the very ethical and theological confusion and concern you've raised. My last point. I think we who do phenomenology of religion and religious experience are really careful about not violating that boundary between the God symbol and the world we study. I don't actually know if folks that do popular science are as careful about that. Because what Rovelli does is reach for his favorite text that gives him an account of how this might be working and start to suggest that studying quantum mechanics leads you to this vision of a world that is empty. And I don't actually know if you can motivate that claim from looking at quantum. Does that answer your question?
It gives some good food for thought.
That the goal is to eat.
Right, I got Ronnie next, and then Justin, and then Mike. That's
Me?
Yeah.
All right, I'll be like, I rethink my question.
Oh, no.
okay. All right, then Justin, Mike, and then Ronnie. You're third now.
Now I'm terrified. When the Q&A becomes Q&A, it's
Yeah,
terrible.
yeah. So Justin first, and then Mike next.
So my question is like methodological.
Yep.
So I'm thinking about, like the Husserlian reduction. So, all the way back, ideas one,
Yep.
That the kind of fundamental move of the Husserlian reduction is this necessity of bracketing, among other things, the natural sciences.
Yep.
Really clear on this point. So my question is like this kind of retrieval of quantum mechanics that you're employing here, is, I guess I'm asking, like, do you see a way of reconciling this with like a Husserlian methodology? Is your answer, I'm just not a Husserlian, I'm using this other phenomenological methodology? I'd just be curious as to how you would situate that framing, because I know you use the language of reduction, but you use it in a very non-Husserlian way.
Yeah. So I think my first answer that I've learned to give to this is, but in ideas too.
Yes. Or else unpublished manuscript.
Or unpublished manuscript.
If you said ideas too, you say unpublished manuscript.
And that's good, but it's the actual answer to your question is I'm not working out of Husserlian phenomenology, but I do think that there's an analogy between eidetic or phenomenological or transcendental reduction, and when we start to imagine the world using quantum theory. And I'm particularly interested and in a paper that did way too much because this is a conference that's looking at everything as nothing. I hit the moment where I went, oh, one of the things I'm interested is in the way we have to imagine these indiscernible phenomena. And I think the eidetic reduction is one way to do that. And I think maybe imagining quantum interrelationality is another, but it's certainly not going to be Husserlian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you follow up though? You look like you would follow up.
I mean, I have lots of thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a sense in which in Husserl where you can employ imaginative variation without using the reduction, and it feels like you're doing something like that.
Yep. That sounds about right.
All right, I got Mike next and then back to.
Thank you, Charlie, for a very nice talk. Very good talk. I'm wondering about the comment you made about the relationality is more important than the relata.
Yep.
And I mean, I want to argue. I wonder if the sort of these mystics that I talked about in Steinbach's, whether it's not the person of God that stands out for the most profoundly. And relationality is something that's implicitly there, and they might think, and they'll subsequently think about it, and actually it belongs then to the overflowing to love for the poor and the whole world and everything else, like Julian of Norwich talks about. But in a relationship, isn't actually the relata much more important and significant in terms of one's attention than the relationality?
Yeah, Mike, that's a great question because it gets me to the limit of how I can answer you using a phenomenological method, because my response immediately is theological, which is to say, from the framework in which I encounter the world, God is triune. And so there is a kind of relationality even in God that's prior to the relationality of creatures. So in that sense, I would probably be loading Trinity into where, in some of the work you gave us yesterday, person was operating for someone like Shaler. With that said, I think for Rovelli and for other people reading quantum theory, there is this desire to find a relatedness of the world that's perhaps similar to, I'm thinking this out loud, similar to the kind of nothingness that Ronnie was talking about this morning, out of which stuff emerges. And I wonder in that sense if relationality isn't the thing that's all the way down, and then relata are ways in which that relationality expresses itself. The last point though is you had a beautiful phrase, which is the things relating are more important. I'll sign up for that all day long. I think that's true. I'm just trying to figure out what is a way that we can start to tie together some of the ways in which accounts of the physical world can illumine how we're thinking about religious experience. Fair? Okay.
All right, Ronnie,
Okay.
and then I got Larry.
Thank you. Nothing to differ. Maybe my question is out of the scope, so I'll try. I bring, since I believe a few of us are interested in converting people to phenomenology. So you keep emphasizing that you're not using the phenomenological method, but in section 58, in ideas 1, the well-known where Husserl addresses the idea of God, it actually communicates some of what you say here. It's not, I wouldn't say that you are completely relating to different churches, okay?
Yeah.
So arguing there that there is no meaning of substance that can be assigned to God, which is good for it is good for you for your argument. But I even would go further and suggest something even more, I would say, more substantive in the good sense. When you look and consider Husserl's theory of Holland parts in the third investigation, there is something, for me, one of the most revealing sentences in Husserl thinking is that when he distinguished between the elements and the two kind of pieces, the independent one, and which are, I think, are pieces, and the dependent are elements. In any event, he says, we in phenomenology are looking for the dependent parts. So this plays perfectly to your argument. So this is just to follow up and to comment. Another idea, which is really, with it, I can think again of your argument, is just to refer to Paul Ricoeur idea of distanciation.
Yeah.
where he established the need for a distance in order to understand, and how can you, if you have something to do on your behalf, to say on your behalf.
Yeah.
Because there are two, in a way, you kind of put out of the system of your argumentation, the aspect of understanding, which I'm okay with that, okay? But when Ricoeur talks about distance, he says, how can we understand? This is part of his hermeneutics.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Phenomenal questions. First, the clarification is I certainly think I'm doing something phenomenological in this. I just don't want to limit phenomenology to Husserl. So I'm happy to do phenomenology in the Husserlian vein, but I also wanted to be honest that I didn't go and read Ideas 1 before putting this together, but I will be stealing all of the references that you just said to put in the notes of the published version. On the Ricoeur stuff, that's what I'm a lot closer to, and you helped me realize that part of what I'm doing and trying to think about closeness is in direct response to Ricoeur's theory of distanciation. I think getting distance from something in order to have a hermeneutic act towards it, to understand it, I have to know that the thing is different from myself in order to confront it in its autonomy, to understand something about it. And I know that there's a lot of theological appropriations of Ricoeur, because I've done some of them, that make a lot of headway in that, in the creator-creature distinction. I was interested in the experience of closeness, though, that would seem to be, we're now getting closer, please.
So, I'm sure you know that Ricoeur articulated his criticism, his idea as a criticism of Gadamer's idea of closeness.
Yep.
So he suggests that the whole thing of understanding is not coming close, but actually the other way around. So you can, I suggest you navigate your way with this different point of references, because eventually you will have your own specific cake out of all these materials, but I think that those, when, as I said, I mean, also you mentioned my presentation, when you see that the same thing can function, can operate, to use things theory differently, so that we're not moving in a sphere of contradictions.
Yeah.
But things join together in their own way, so we can. So Gadamer and Ricoeur can sit in the same church, nevertheless, despite all those rhetoric of distinguishing one from the other.
I think that's spot on, and I have no response other than yes.
I like this response.
Invite me back.
Yeah.
I always said, "Mommy is always right."
Yeah, that's right. Larry, I'll go you next.
Yeah, thank you so much. A great, really cool paper. So I'm wondering, you talked about, these the invisible quantum particles, and the fact that we can't see them, and that makes the phenomenology a little tricky. And what scientists use to get over that hurdle is they build models, right? They have data, and they use the data, they infer to the best explanation, and that explanation is their model, right? And similarly, but differently, in our religious traditions, our religious language is building models, or sometimes we call them metaphors, right, for these things we can't express, because we're too close to them. It's reading the newspaper when it's plastered to your nose, you can't make it out, right? And so then we come up with something else to try to tell that story. I'm wondering how you see phenomenology helping us understand the relation between model and what's modeled, whatever that is, and the closeness of the model to what's modeled. Can phenomenology help us figure that out? Because boy, that's a big problem in science and religion.
Great question, Larry. I think my first answer is that if there's a method that will be able to figure this out, I'm going to bet that phenomenology will be involved in it. Because what I hear in the model to try to figure out the phenomena we can't see, for lack of a better term, is trying to get at a way of thinking about it that got us close to it, while bracketing out other aspects of experience. I think where this comes down in contemporary science, to the best of my understanding, is that it becomes backwards from the scientific method. We construct the model and now go in search of sort of empirical verification, as opposed to running a bunch of empirical experiments and then developing a model to try to make sense of what we've observed.
Yep.
I wonder somewhat if that's also what happens with some contemporary discussions of religious experience, if it's constructed in such a way that let's build a model of the kind of divine we're interested in, and now let's go in search of people to put in the chairs to populate this community. That structure of coming up with the model and then going in search of what it's reflecting, that's the very thing I think phenomenology can help correct. Because what it should be is, I would argue, to try to respond to phenomena as they appear, and then do the poetics that constructs a model to try to articulate the experience that I've had. That makes sense as a response?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I missed the first half, so, okay, really happy you talked about Julian, and I think the spirit of my question is related to the previous one. But, in the phenomenological analyses of like mystical accounts, they're bringing in theological presuppositions, like when I was talking about veritas yesterday and the fusion with the spirit. And then like the acorn, was it an acorn? Oh, hazelnut?
It's a hazelnut, but yes,
Being,
it
like,
can be an
love.
acorn.
I think that's, how do we get to that as like a conclusion? And like, how do you disambiguate like the theological presuppositions, like the spirit being infused in the world, or the world is loved by a creator? Like, how do we get to that as a conclusion rather than, or, yeah, does that question makes sense?
Yes, no, I love that question. I want to be honest that I don't think looking to the mystics, you can actually get out from a presumption that the world is infused with the creator. I think if the text we choose to read is one that emerges from that experience and it's writing about it to try to conjure that experience for the reader, it's going to be baked in. What I think we might be able to do with phenomenological readings of such things is get some of the models that I was talking about with Larry. Like I can go and retrieve from the tradition, look, someone had this experience, they wrote about it quite beautifully, and it gives us something to then think through with some of the tools we've constructed otherwise. I think the reason I'm interested in doing that sort of work is it lets me at least be honest about when I'm constructing a theory that's meant to be agnostic to the particular traditions, so that I can describe religious experience in such a way that it's going to land for someone who's using a Buddhist text to talk about the experience of nothingness behind the veil of the illusory world that I experience, versus when I read a Christian text that's illuminating something about a world that God loves into being. I want to be able to both sort of get data about the numinous from both of these writings in a theological register, but also to talk about experience in such a way that it's applicable to both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very helpful for me too.
Let me follow up on that.
Sure.
Because the flaw I see with your proposed methodology, and I think this emerges actually in religious studies philosophy of religion, like the sort of critical philosophy of religion, is you're still only looking for data from things you presuppose to be religious, which means you're still operating within a particular, like you still have at least an operative concept or model that you're working with. So you're not as model free even from the get-go as you think you are. And so I wonder if starting instead in, this is my wager, right? In actual, the structures of experiencing itself, how does experience need to function? And then from there, what kinds of things fulfill that function? And then maybe you find out, this thing turns out to be religious, even though normally we wouldn't think it's religious. That's interesting too. Like you see what I'm saying? Like about the.
That's partially to respond to you, Neil, is I own that I'm in the text that I'm reading and writing about, there's a presumption of religious experience, right? It's precisely that flaw is what I would level at Rovelli, who's this incredible writer that I found really beautiful to read, but he's got his beef with theism and he really likes Nagarjuna, and it gives him an account of something that gets him a presupposition that spits itself out. That's why I tried to start with things like the Steelers game or a Taylor Swift concert to be like, I don't know if my work is on experience qua experience. I'm interested in when people report, I just had a religious experience, and now I want to try to tease out some of the things there. That make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Makes sense. Let's see, we have time for one more question. Yeah, Neil.
You know, after hearing the talk earlier from Michelle Bigbo, I wonder what your, kind of what your take is on what he had to say. It was, just a side comment, it was really interesting to see the conversation between him and Harman, because I got the sense that on one side you have someone for whom the observational apparatus is necessary for drawing certain ontologies about discrete objects. And so he wants to follow the conclusions of the observational apparatus, which tells him there are no discrete objects, whereas Harman wants to insist on models, wants to insist even on the principled aspect that there needs to be this distinction between the discrete and the continuous.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, how do you see that conversation happening in relation to what you're doing? Are models going to help us? Does error help us perhaps in coming in new ways? I'm thinking of Gaston Bachelard here, who says that we're not actually looking at observational data and drawing conclusions. Errors are actually productive of concepts, which then allow us to look at reality in a different sense and understand it differently. So I wonder maybe if you can put what you're doing in conversation with what we saw earlier.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the quickest way I can do that is I really like when Harman gave us the continuum between sort of continuity, which I thought about like a wave, or discrete stuff like particle, or relativity versus quantum mechanics. And you seem to have to pick which way you're going to view the world. What I think I tried to do with my paper that I'm still exploring as a method is to try to chart between the two in response to religious phenomena, rather than try to start from one picture of the world and take that as a route to another, instead of trying to get close to something that self-reports as religious. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. I also really enjoyed the talks earlier as I sat there and went, yep, someone far better than I has explained quantum mechanics, so we can skip that section of that. Thank you all very much.
Join me, thank you.